Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner.
Abuse through racism, alcoholism, suicide, devaluation of virginity, and deterioration of family.
By Kayla and Kristen Ekman. On page 178 and 179, Faulkner portrays suicide through Quentin. Although Faulkner does not say it directly, the highlighted sections are clues that Quentin is preparing to leave his house to commit suicide. On page 178, there are context clues that show that Quentin is preparing to leave his house for the last time. Faulkner writes things like, "The last note sounded. I put my vest on. I put my coat on." Early in the chapter, Faulkner talks about Quentin going to a store and buying brick-like objects so that he could jump off the bridge and it would hold him down in the water. At this point in the chapter, Quentin is at home for the last time preparing himself to leave and jump off the bridge. On page 179, Faulkner writes, "I squeezed the brush as dry as I could and put it back in the bag and shut it, and went to the door again. But before I snapped the light out, I looked around to see if there was anything else. Then I saw that I had forgotten my hat." We know Quentin is going to commit suicide, and he's leaving his house for the last time because he brushes his teeth and turns out the light, takes his hat, and takes the bag with the bricks and walks to the bridge.
Faulkner portrays devaluation of virginity on page 77. I highlighted a section where Faulkner mentions time. Before the highlighted section, Faulkner mentions that Christ had no sister. Because Quentin is the one talking, and he references time later, this suggests that Quentin is somehow lost in time. Or at least this is how Quentin justifies his committing incest. In the second highlighted section, Faulkner mentions roses. We know from previous readings that Caddy is associated with roses, and Faulkner uses the roses to imply that we're talking about Caddy here. On this page, Quentin is admitting to his father that he had committed incest. By doing so, this is another way that Faulkner portrays abuse throughout the book. On page 198, we examine abuse through deterioration of the family. In the first highlighted section, Faulkner talks about how Mrs. Compson shows disregard for Caddy and Quentin while she's talking to Jason. A direct quote from the book says, "Mother kept saying she would at least have enough regard for the family not to jeopardize my chance after she and Quentin had had theirs." This confirms what I had said earlier. The second highlighted section has Mother talking directly to Jason. She says, "To be contaminated by that atmosphere, it'll be hard enough as it is, with the heritage she already has." This section shows how Mother feels that the connotation for the Compson name has been tarnished, and enforces the idea of the deterioration of the family. On page 15, we examine abuse through racism. At the top of the page, Faulkner mentions Lester, who we know previously is a slave. The first highlighted section at the top of the page, Lester is talking about Benji when he says, "He wouldn't know a quarter if he was to see it, would he?" This is an example of reverse racism. Another example of racism at the top of the page is the show that Lester's talking about. It is a minstrel show.
In the middle passage, Lester's conversation says, "Niggers' money good as white folks, I reckon. White folks give nigger money because know first. White men come along with a band going to get it all back so nigger can go to work for some more." This passage about money highlights the inequality of race in the South.
The last highlighted section says, "Ain't got nothing against them. I goes my way and lets white folks go theirs. I ain't studying that show." The show that they're referring to is the minstrel show. Faulkner uses the minstrel show to exemplify the poor treatment of African Americans during this time. And Lester, by saying, "I ain't studying that show," he is refusing to accept the abuse from the minstrel show.
On page 180, Faulkner shows abuse through alcoholism. The alcoholic in the Compson family is Mr. Compson. I've circled all the words that say she or her because the she that Mr. and Mrs. Compson are talking about on this page is their daughter, Caddy. The abuse is being delivered by Mr. Compson and received by his daughter. Mr. Compson is drunk and says rude things about his own daughter. He says, "Once a bitch, always a bitch." What I says, "You're lucky if her playing out of school is all that worries you." Another abusive comment made by Mr. Compson is, "You're downtown all day. You ought to see her if she stays on the streets." Mr. Compson is implying that she's doing something irrational or unacceptable. Even though Caddy does not appear or speak in this conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Compson, we learn indirectly that Mr. Compson's alcoholism is negatively affecting Caddy.